The air in the Shrine Auditorium on the night of the 83rd Academy Awards is thick, with the ghosts of Hollywood past and the frantic electric hum of Hollywood present. It is February 27th, 2011, and in this cathedral of dreams a coronation is about to take place. Seated in the audience is Natalie Portman. She is not merely an actress tonight, she is a vessel of artistic sacrifice, a walking testament to the agonizing transformative power of her craft. She is pregnant, radiant, and on the precipice of the industry's highest honor for a performance that nearly consumed her whole. Her portrayal of Nina Sayers in Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan was not acting. It was a psychological excavation, a brutal, year-long descent into the obsessive, paranoid, and physically punishing world of professional ballet, a journey that stripped her down to bone and nerve endings, blurring the line between the artist and the art until they were indistinguishable. This single night, this single golden statue is the culmination of a narrative that began nearly 2 decades earlier. It is the ultimate validation for a child prodigy who, from the moment she stepped into the spotlight, was forced to build a fortress of intellect around her very soul to survive. It is the final, unassailable proof of seriousness for the young woman who once walked the halls of Harvard, desperately trying to prove she was more than just a face on a movie poster. When her name is called, the applause that erupts is not just for a performance, but for a journey. As she walks to the stage, the image is a perfect, breathtaking paradox. A woman on the verge of bringing new life into the world, being honored for a role in which she masterfully choreographed her own destruction. This moment is not an end point. It is a nexus, a convergence of profound personal love, born from the crucible of that very film and the absolute zenith of professional triumph. But to understand the weight of this victory, one must return to its source. A quiet, bookish girl, an only child of immigrant parents, a prodigy who discovered that her greatest defense against the predatory gaze of the world was to become so fiercely intelligent, so undeniably serious that no one would dare look at her in any other way. Natalie Hirschlag was born on June 9, 1981, in the ancient sun-baked city of Jerusalem. Her existence was rooted in stories of survival and intellect. Her father, Avner, an Israeli-born gynecologist, and her mother, Shelley, an American-born artist, were themselves the children of immigrants, descendants of Jewish families from Russia, Austria, and Poland who had sought refuge and built new lives. Her family tree was heavy with history, its branches shadowed by the horrors of the Holocaust and strengthened by the resilience of those who endured. This heritage, a blend of European intellectualism and Israeli fortitude, was the soil in which she was planted. She was an only child, a fact she would later identify as the key that unlocked her entire career. In a family unit of 3, the focus was intense, the love concentrated. There were no sibling rivalries to diffuse the attention of 2 highly educated, deeply thoughtful parents. Their world revolved around her, nurturing a precocious intellect and an insatiable curiosity from her earliest days. When she was 3, her father's medical career transplanted the family to the United States, first to Washington, D.C., then Connecticut, finally settling in the suburban enclave of Long Island, New York. It was a childhood of constant movement, of learning to adapt, of observing. It was a classic American Jewish upbringing, steeped in a profound respect for education, art, and intellectual pursuit. But the quiet world of academia and suburban comfort was destined to be interrupted. At the age of 10, in a moment of pure unscripted serendipity that has since become Hollywood lore, she was discovered. Not in an acting class, not at an audition, but in a pizza parlor. An agent for Revlon Cosmetics saw not a child eating a slice of pizza, but a face with a future. They approached her, offering her a modeling contract, a gateway to a world of glamour and artifice. The 10-year-old Natalie, already possessed of a seriousness that belied her years, found the idea of modeling to be, in her own words, a bore. She had no interest in being a passive image. She wanted to be a storyteller. She wanted to act. This quiet declaration set in motion a chain of events that would change her life. She began attending theater camps, immersing herself in the craft, and the talent was immediately startlingly apparent. It was a talent not of mimicry but of empathy, a profound ability to inhabit the internal lives of others. The world was about to be introduced to this talent in a form so potent, so controversial, and so unforgettable that it would forever define the first chapter of her life. The role was Mathilde Landau. The film was Luc Besson's Léon, the professional. And for the 11-year-old girl about to step onto that set, it would be both a baptism by fire and the beginning of a lifelong war to define her own identity. Luc Besson, the maverick French director, was searching for a soul. For his 1994 English-language thriller, Léon, the professional, he had written a character of impossible complexity. Mathilde, a 12-year-old girl who finds her entire family brutally murdered by a corrupt DEA agent and seeks refuge with her neighbor, a reclusive, emotionally stunted hitman named Léon. The character was a cocktail of contradictions, a street-smart, chain-smoking child with the hardened cynicism of an adult, yet possessed of a raw, desperate vulnerability and a longing for love. The casting call drew 2,000 hopefuls. The casting director, Todd Thaler, initially dismissed Natalie Hirschlag. She was 11, too young, too fragile for the dark, psychologically treacherous material. The rejection should have been the end of it, but for the young Natalie, it was merely an obstacle. In a second audition, this time in front of Besson himself, she was asked to perform the scene where Mathilde discovers the massacre and realizes the depth of her loss. What Besson witnessed was not a child pretending to be sad. It was a terrifying, authentic transmutation of grief. He saw an old soul looking out through a child's eyes, an intuitive grasp of pain and loss that could not be taught. He gave her the part on the spot. He had found his Mathilde. The decision was made to protect her. At her parents' insistence and to shield the young girl from the inevitable glare of publicity, she adopted her paternal grandmother's maiden name. Natalie Hirschlag, the studious Jewish girl from Long Island, would remain private. Natalie Portman, the actress, was born. This separation of identities, this conscious bifurcation of her public and private self, would become the foundational theme of her entire life. Her parents were a constant protective presence on set, scrutinizing the script, collaborating with Besson to soften the most controversial edges of the story, ensuring their daughter was shielded from the psychological undertones of the narrative she was embodying. But a shield can only protect so much. The performance that emerged was a miracle of child acting, a portrait of damaged innocence that was haunting, mesmerizing, and deeply unsettling. Portman didn't just play a role, she channeled a reality, her performance so natural it felt like documentary. The world was captivated and horrified. The film was a critical and commercial success, and it launched her career into the stratosphere. But it came at a profound, unseen cost. The world did not just see a brilliant young actress. It saw a Lolita figure. The complex, often troubling dynamic between Mathilde and Léon was interpreted and in many corners sensationalized as a story of precocious and even perverse sexuality. At 12 years old, Natalie Portman became the object of a form of public fascination that was both intoxicating and terrifying. Fan mail arrived filled with disturbing, inappropriate fantasies. Interviewers asked intrusive, unsettling questions. A countdown clock to her 18th birthday appeared online. The experience was profoundly scarring. As she would later articulate, this early aggressive sexualization took her own burgeoning sexuality away from her, making her afraid of it. It forced her to build a wall. a fortress to protect herself from a world that saw her not as a talented child but as an object. Her defense mechanism was absolute. She would become unimpeachable. My way of protecting myself, she would later explain, was to be like, I'm so serious. I'm so studious, I'm smart, and that's not the kind of girl you attack. This wasn't a choice born of academic passion, not at first. It was an act of survival. She wielded her intelligence like a broadsword, her seriousness like a shield. She consciously chose roles that defied the girlfriend or ingenue trope, seeking out complex characters in films like Ted Demi's Beautiful Girls and Tim Burton's Mars Attacks. She even famously turned down the role of Lolita in Adrian Lyne's 1997 adaptation. The message was clear. You will not define me. You will not objectify me. You will take me seriously. This fierce, self-protective intellectualism would lead her to the one place that, in her mind, represented the absolute pinnacle of seriousness, a place where she could finally shed the skin of the movie star and be judged not for her face but for her mind. It would lead her to the hallowed, intimidating gates of Harvard University. In the fall of 1999, at the very peak of her global fame, Natalie Portman made a decision that baffled Hollywood. Just months after the release of Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, a film that made her face one of the most recognizable on the planet, she enrolled as a freshman at Harvard University. She would major in psychology. To the industry, it seemed like a strange, perhaps even self-sabotaging career move. To her, it was an act of profound, necessary self-preservation. Harvard was to be her sanctuary, the ultimate bastion of the intellectual fortress she had been building since she was 12. It was a place where she could finally be Natalie Hirschlag, the student, and leave Natalie Portman, the actress, at the door. "I'd rather be smart than a movie star," she famously declared, a quote that would define this era of her life. The reality, however, was far more complex. The fortress, it turned out, was built on a foundation of deep-seated insecurity, as she would later reveal in her deeply personal 2015 Harvard Class Day speech. Her arrival in Cambridge was not a triumphant one. It was terrifying. She was completely overwhelmed, an imposter in a sea of intellectual giants. She felt her presence there was a mistake, that she had only been admitted because of her fame and that she would soon be exposed as a fraud. This imposter syndrome became a driving, and at times punishing, force. To prove to her peers, and more importantly to herself, that she belonged, she took on the most difficult courses, piling her schedule with neurobiology and advanced modern Hebrew literature. I realized that seriousness for seriousness' sake was its own kind of trophy, she reflected, and a dubious one, a pose I sought to counter some half-imagined argument about who I was. She was still fighting the ghosts of Matilda, still trying to armor herself against a world that might not take her seriously. She was living in a crucible of her own making, a self-imposed trial by intellectual fire. This internal struggle was set against the surreal backdrop of her life as a global icon. During her Harvard years, she filmed Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones. The paradox was staggering. One week she was in a lecture hall, grappling with complex psychological theories. The next, she was on a green screen set in Australia, delivering lines as Queen Padme Amidala, a character in a sci-fi universe beloved by millions but increasingly maligned by critics. The prequel trilogy, despite its massive commercial success, was met with a wave of intense fan and critical backlash. The dialogue was ridiculed. The performances were often described as wooden, and Portman, as one of the trilogy's central figures, bore a significant portion of that disappointment. The experience was a bummer, a painful collision of sky-high anticipation and crushing reality. Imagine the psychological dissonance, desperately seeking intellectual validation in the most demanding academic environment on Earth, while the most visible work of your career is being criticized for its perceived lack of depth. It was a profound and public test of her resilience. The Harvard years were not easy. She admitted to struggling with periods of depression, of spending too much time missing sunlight. There were moments when her motto for her schoolwork was simply done, not good. But through the struggle, a profound transformation occurred. She began to find a community, to form genuine friendships, and to learn for the sake of learning, not for the sake of proving something. She worked as a research assistant in a psychology lab, co-authoring a published paper on the frontal lobe's activation during object permanence. This was tangible, empirical proof of her intellectual capabilities, a private victory far more meaningful than any box office receipt. By the time she graduated in 2003, she had done more than just earn a degree. She had reforged her identity. She had walked through the fire of her own insecurities and emerged not just with a diploma, but with a newfound sense of self. She had proven to the world, but more importantly to herself, that the fortress was real. She was not just a serious actress, she was a serious person. This hard-won confidence would arm her for the next and most daring phase of her career. A series of audacious, artistically risky roles that would lead her to the performance of her life. Armed with a Harvard degree and a fortified sense of self, Natalie Portman returned to Hollywood not as the prodigy she had been, but as a formidable artist ready to take control of her narrative. The post-Harvard era was defined by a series of bold, deliberate choices, a conscious shedding of her child star skin to embrace complex, often dangerous adult roles. This was the period where she transitioned from being a serious student into a fearless actress. Her first major move was a collaboration with the legendary director Mike Nichols on the 2004 relationship drama Closer. Her role as Alice, a mysterious and emotionally volatile stripper, was a radical departure. It required a raw, unsentimental sexuality and a profound emotional depth that stunned audiences and critics alike. The role was a tightrope walk over a canyon of clichés, but Portman navigated it with a fierce intelligence and a heartbreaking vulnerability. It was a declaration of artistic maturity. The performance earned her a Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress and her first Academy Award nomination. The girl who had built a fortress to protect herself from being objectified was now using her art to explore the very complexities of sexuality and power that she had once feared. She was no longer hiding. She was excavating. This artistic fearlessness became her new signature. In 2006, she shaved her head on camera for her role as Evie Hammond in the dystopian thriller V for Vendetta. The act was more than just a physical transformation. It was a symbolic shearing away of any lingering vanity, a total commitment to the character's journey from a frightened victim to a defiant revolutionary. She was actively seeking out challenges, roles that demanded not just emotional but physical transformation. She was drawn to characters on the edge, women grappling with immense historical and psychological pressures. This pursuit would lead her to the project that had been quietly gestating in the mind of director Darren Aronofsky for nearly a decade, a project that would demand more from her than any role before or since. It was a psychological horror film set in the ferociously competitive, physically punishing world of professional ballet. It was called Black Swan. Aronofsky had first discussed the idea with her back in 2000, but now, a decade later, she was ready. The role of Nina Sayers was a perfect storm of her deepest artistic impulses and her most profound personal fears. Nina is a technically perfect but emotionally repressed ballerina, desperate to win the lead role in a production of Swan Lake. To do so, she must embody not only the innocent white swan, a role she is perfect for, but also the sensual, malevolent black swan, a persona that requires her to unlock a dark, primal side she has long suppressed. The journey to find her inner Black Swan triggers a terrifying descent into madness, paranoia, and psychosis. For Portman, this was not just a role. It was an ordeal. A year before filming even began, she started a grueling, all-consuming training regimen. 5 to 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Ballet classes, swimming, cross-training. She dislocated a rib. She endured countless injuries. Her body, already petite, was whittled down by 20 pounds, leaving her gaunt and fragile. The physical punishment was immense, but it was in service of the psychological transformation. She was not just learning to dance like a ballerina, she was learning to think like one, to feel the relentless perfectionism, the gnawing insecurity, the all-consuming ambition that defines that world. The film shoot itself was an intense, claustrophobic experience, guided by Aronofsky's famously demanding directorial style. He sought to break down the barrier between actor and character, to push Portman to a place of raw, unfiltered emotion. The psychological toll was immense. She was inhabiting a character who was losing her grip on reality, and there were days when she felt her own sanity begin to fray. It was the first time I understood how you could get so wrapped up in a role that it could sort of take you down, she later admitted. But within this crucible of artistic suffering, something unexpected blossomed. The choreographer hired to train her and craft the film's dance sequences was a principal dancer from the New York City Ballet, Benjamin Milpide. Amidst the grueling rehearsals and psychological torment of the production, they fell in love. It was a romance born in the heart of the storm, a flicker of light in the psychological darkness she was navigating. This profound personal connection, this discovery of love and partnership amidst the artistic chaos, became the anchor that kept her from being completely swept away by the role. She was descending into madness on screen while simultaneously building a foundation for a new life off-screen. The duality was as profound as the one her character was experiencing. The release of Black Swan in late 2010 was not a premiere. It was an explosion. The film was a cultural phenomenon, a critical darling, and a commercial smash hit. At the center of the inferno was Natalie Portman's performance, a feat of physical and psychological transformation that was universally hailed as one of the greatest of its generation. It was a performance that transcended acting, a terrifyingly vivid portrait of an artist's descent into madness that felt less like a portrayal and more like a possession. The awards season that followed was a victory lap, a foregone conclusion. She swept the Golden Globes, the BAFTAs, the Screen Actors Guild Awards. The journey culminated on that fateful night at the 83rd Academy Awards, where she won the Oscar for Best Actress. Standing on that stage, pregnant with her first child by the man she had met and fallen in love with during the film's creation, her triumph was absolute. The studious girl from Harvard, the child prodigy who had hidden behind a shield of intellect, had finally been recognized for an act of pure, terrifying, artistic abandon. She had risked her body and her psyche for her art, and she had been rewarded with its highest honor. It was the perfect, triumphant closing of a chapter, but pinnacles are, by their nature, precarious. After reaching the absolute summit of her profession, the question became, what now? The years following her Oscar win were a period of deliberate recalibration. She had proven her seriousness, her artistry, and her dedication beyond any doubt. Now she had the freedom to choose not just roles, but a new direction for her career. The most significant turning point was her move behind the camera. For nearly a decade, she had been nursing a quiet, deeply personal ambition to direct a feature film. The project she chose was not a safe Hollywood indie. It was an audacious, challenging, and deeply personal undertaking, an adaptation of Israeli author Amos Oz's celebrated memoir, A Tale of Love and Darkness. The film, which she also wrote and starred in, was shot entirely in Hebrew. It was a powerful, full-circle return to her roots, an artistic endeavor that connected her to her birthplace, her language, and the complex, often painful history of her people. The film explored the birth of the State of Israel through the eyes of a young boy and his deeply intellectual, tragically melancholic mother, Fania, played by Portman herself. The character of Fania was a deliberate choice, another exploration of the female psyche under immense pressure. A woman whose rich inner world of stories and fantasies could not save her from the harsh realities of her life. Directing was an act of profound vulnerability and immense courage. She was no longer just a performer executing a director's vision. She was the architect, the storyteller, the one in control of the entire narrative. While the film received a mixed critical reception, its completion was a monumental personal and professional achievement. It was a declaration of independence. It marked her transition from actress to auteur, a movie to become the primary author of her own work. This desire to control her narrative extended beyond her film choices. She became an increasingly powerful and articulate voice for social and political causes. A committed vegan since 2009, she produced a documentary, Eating Animals, exposing the brutalities of factory farming. She became a prominent advocate in the Time's Up movement, speaking out with fierce eloquence against gender inequality and the systemic abuse of power in Hollywood and beyond. She was no longer just using her intellect as a shield. She was wielding it as a weapon, a tool to effect change in the world. This period of her life was about building. Building a family. She and Milipide welcomed a son, Aleph, in 2011 and a daughter, Amalia, in 2017. Building a body of work that reflected her own values and interests, taking on challenging roles in films like Jackie, where she delivered another Oscar-nominated performance as the iconic First Lady, and the cerebral sci-fi thriller Annihilation. And building a platform, using her fame not just as a spotlight for herself, but as a megaphone for the causes she believed in. The girl who had once felt the need to be small and serious to be safe was now standing tall, using her powerful voice without fear. She was no longer reacting to the world, she was actively shaping it. The trajectory of a star, like any celestial body, is not always a steady upward climb. It is subject to the gravitational pulls of life, of unforeseen forces that can alter its course. For Natalie Portman, the architect of a meticulously crafted career and a fiercely protected private life, the last several years have been a period of profound change and public reevaluation, marked by both artistic evolution and personal upheaval. She continued to make bold, often unconventional choices in her work, seeking out projects that challenged her and subverted audience expectations. Her performance in 2023's May-December, directed by Todd Haynes, was a masterclass in subtlety and psychological nuance. She played an actress, Elizabeth Berry, who is preparing for a role by studying a real-life woman, Gracie, played by Julianne Moore, who was at the center of a notorious tabloid scandal 2 decades earlier. The role was a meta-commentary on the very nature of acting, of observation, and of the vampiric process of storytelling. I'd rather be smart than a movie star. Natalie Portman once made that declaration, a defiant statement of intent from a young woman already trapped in the global spotlight. But to transform that single sentence into a lived reality, she would spend more than 3 decades in a quiet, relentless war. A war against fame, against the industry's predatory gaze, and often against the very insecurities planted within her own soul. On the red carpet, Natalie Portman is the epitome of elegance and intellect. But behind the camera's flash, she is a silent warrior, the architect of a formidable intellectual fortress built to protect herself from the invisible wounds of Hollywood. The story of Natalie Portman is not merely the chronicle of a cinematic conquest. It is the unforgiving journey of a relentless quest for self-definition. The apex of that battle occurred on the night of February 27, 2011, at the 83rd Academy Awards. Pregnant, radiant, and on the verge of being honored for a role that nearly consumed her in Black Swan, she was a living paradox. A woman about to bring life into the world, celebrated for masterfully choreographing her own character's destruction. This victory was not for a single performance. It was validation for a decades-long struggle. From the young girl Matilda, framed by the gaze of others, to the producer, director, and powerful voice for her own beliefs, Natalie Portman has rewritten the greatest role of her life, herself. And this is the story of that script. Her origins are not in the sun-drenched landscape of Hollywood ambition, but in the ancient scholarly city of Jerusalem. Born Natalie Hirschlag on June 9, 1981, she was the product of a heritage steeped in intellect and survival. Her father, Avner, an Israeli-born fertility specialist, and her mother, Shelley, an American-born artist who would become her agent, carried with them the stories of their own parents, Jewish immigrants from across Eastern Europe who had fled persecution and found refuge in new lands. Her ancestry was a tapestry woven with threads of academic pursuit and profound historical trauma, a lineage that valued education not as a luxury, but as a tool for endurance. This environment, combined with the focused, concentrated love that comes with being an only child, created a prodigy. She was not just bright, she was possessed of a deep, almost unnerving seriousness. When her father's medical career moved the family to the United States, she became a quiet observer, an eternal student of human behavior. Adapting to new environments on the East Coast with a precocious understanding of the world around her, this studious tranquility was shattered by a moment of pure chance. At 10 years old, in the mundane setting of a Long Island pizza parlor, she was spotted by a talent scout. The offer was for modeling, a world of silent, two-dimensional beauty. For the young Natalie, who had already spent years in dance classes and summer theater camps, the idea was anathema. She didn't want to be looked at, she wanted to be heard. She wanted to act. This quiet refusal, this early assertion of intellectual over aesthetic value, set her on a path that would lead just 1 year later to an audition that would define her entire youth. The film was Léon, The Professional, a dark, violent, and psychologically complex thriller from French director Luc Besson. The role was Matilda, a 12-year-old girl orphaned by a corrupt DEA agent who forms a dangerous and deeply complicated bond with her hitman neighbor. It was a role that would demand an actress with the emotional depth of a seasoned veteran and the innocence of a child, a paradox that would launch a brilliant career and simultaneously build the walls of a lifelong fortress. The casting process for Léon. The Professional was a citywide search for an impossible combination of innocence and world weariness. Thousands of young girls auditioned for the role of Matilda, but none could capture the character's volatile, heartbreaking duality. The initial verdict on 11-year-old Natalie Hirschlag was a swift rejection. Too young. The casting director saw her quiet, bookish demeanor and dismissed her as too fragile for the film's brutal, emotionally treacherous landscape. But Luc Besson, a director known for his visionary, almost obsessive pursuit of the right actor, agreed to see her for a second time. In a sterile, empty room, he asked her to perform the scene where Matilda, having just lost everything, begs the hitman Léon to take her in. What happened next became the stuff of legend, the quiet, serious girl transformed. She didn't cry on cue. She seemed to access a well of authentic, bottomless grief that was terrifying in its intensity. The tears that streamed down her face were real. The desperation in her voice was palpable. It was not a performance. It was a channeling. Besson was stunned into silence. He had not found a child who could act like Matilda. He had found Matilda herself. To protect her from the storm of publicity that would inevitably follow, the family made a crucial decision. She would adopt her paternal grandmother's maiden name, Portman. This act created a deliberate schism between her public and private selves. Natalie Hirschlag could remain the studious girl from Long Island, while Natalie Portman became the vessel for the work. This duality would be her shield. On set, her parents were her guardians, an unwavering presence who collaborated with Besson to navigate the script's most controversial elements. They insisted on a limit of 5 cigarettes in any given scene and had the more overtly sexual undertones of the original script removed. They were her protectors, attempting to build a firewall between their daughter and the dark adult world she was so brilliantly portraying. But the power of her performance transcended any script revision. It was so raw, so unnervingly authentic that it created a cultural firestorm. The film was a worldwide success, but the discourse surrounding it was fraught with a mixture of awe and deep discomfort. The world saw a 12-year-old girl who smoked, swore, and handled firearms with a chilling proficiency. The complex codependent relationship between Matilda and the adult Léon was seen by many through a provocative, sexualized lens. Natalie Portman, the child, became conflated with Matilda, the Lolita figure. This public projection had a profound and scarring impact on the young actress. As she later recounted, her own emerging sexuality was co-opted and distorted by the public gaze, making her feel afraid of her own power. The fan mail she received was often disturbing. The questions from journalists were invasive. She was an object of a fascination that felt both like adoration and a threat. It was in this crucible of unwanted attention that her lifelong defense mechanism was forged. She made a conscious, calculated decision. She would build a fortress of intellect so high and so impenetrable that no one could ever reduce her to a mere object again. I understood that the way to be safe was to be serious, she would later reflect, to be studious, to be smart. It was a strategy of survival. She began to choose roles with a fierce, almost academic rigor, turning down anything that played into the ingenue archetype. This quest to be seen as serious, to be valued for her mind above all else, would culminate in the most audacious move of her young career. A self-imposed exile from Hollywood to the one place on earth that represented the undisputed pinnacle of intellectual achievement, Harvard University. The decision to attend Harvard in 1999 was an act of profound rebellion. At a moment when Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, had made her a global icon, when Hollywood was laying its treasures at her feet, she chose to walk away. She enrolled not as Natalie Portman, the movie star, but as Natalie Hirschlag, psychology major. The choice was a public declaration of the war she had been waging preemptively for years. "I don't care if college ruins my career," she stated at the time. "I'd rather be smart than a movie star." This quote became her mantra, the defining thesis of her young adulthood. For her, Harvard was more than a university. It was a sanctuary, a place where the currency of fame was worthless and the only thing that mattered was the rigor of her mind. She was deliberately stepping out of the spotlight and into the library stacks, seeking a validation that no box office number or golden trophy could provide. The reality of this intellectual pilgrimage, however, was far more grueling than she had anticipated. As she confessed years later in her 20 Harvard Class Day address, she arrived in Cambridge not with confidence, but with a paralyzing case of imposter syndrome. Surrounded by some of the most brilliant young minds in the world, she was convinced that she was the actress, the affirmative action case who had only been admitted because of her celebrity. "I felt like I wasn't smart enough to be in this group," she admitted, "that every time I opened my mouth I would have to prove I wasn't just a dumb actress." This profound insecurity lit a fire under her. To prove her worthiness, she overcompensated, loading her schedule with the most challenging courses, from neurobiology to advanced Hebrew literature. She became a fixture in the library, a research assistant in a psychology lab, driven by a desperate need to demonstrate that she belonged. She was still fighting the ghost of Matilda, still building her fortress brick by intellectual brick. "I was so serious," she said of her time there, a seriousness that was both a genuine passion and a carefully maintained suit of armor. This intense academic pressure was compounded by the surreal reality of her ongoing film career. During summer breaks, she would fly to Australia and Italy to film Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones, and later Revenge of the Sith. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. One moment she was Natalie Portman, debating Freudian theory in a crowded lecture hall. The next she was Queen Padme Amidala, navigating galactic politics on a vast green screen stage. While she was earning the respect of her professors, the Star Wars prequel trilogy was enduring a storm of critical and fan backlash. The films were lambasted for their stilted dialogue and perceived lack of emotional depth. For Portman, it was a deeply frustrating experience. The project that made her a household name across the globe was simultaneously the one for which she received some of the harshest criticism of her career. The very work that defined her as a movie star was being used as evidence against her seriousness as an artist, creating a painful paradox at the heart of her public identity. Yet through the struggle, the depression, and the immense pressure, Harvard reforged her. She learned to embrace her own intellectual curiosity, not as a defense, but as a genuine passion. She co-authored a scientific paper titled Frontal Lobe Activation During Object Permanence, Data from Near-Infrared Spectroscopy. The achievement was a quiet personal triumph, a piece of empirical evidence that she was exactly who she had set out to be. She graduated in 2003 with a degree in psychology and a newfound sense of self-possession. The fortress was no longer just a defense, it had become a palace. She had survived the trial by fire she had set for herself. She returned to her film career not as a star who had taken an interesting detour, but as a formidable artist armed with the intellectual confidence to deconstruct her own image and take on the most audacious and transformative roles of her life. Emerging from the academic crucible of Harvard, Natalie Portman re-entered the film world with a quiet, steely confidence. The next phase of her career would be a masterclass in artistic deconstruction, a deliberate and fearless dismantling of the child star persona she had both cultivated and been confined by. She was no longer proving she was serious, she was demonstrating what that seriousness could achieve. Her first major artistic statement was the 2004 film Closer, directed by the legendary Mike Nichols. The role of Alice Ayres, a self-possessed, enigmatic stripper with a history of trauma, was a calculated risk. It required her to navigate a landscape of adult sexuality and emotional brutality that was a world away from the chaste royalty of Padme Amidala. It was a role that could have easily veered into exploitation, but in Portman's hands, Alice became a figure of mesmerizing complexity and heartbreaking strength. Her performance was a revelation, a tightrope walk of vulnerability and defiance. The infamous scene where her character coolly, almost clinically, details her sexual acts to a jealous lover was a shocking display of her newfound artistic daring. It was a performance that earned her a Golden Globe and her first Oscar nomination. But more importantly, it was a declaration. The girl who had built a fortress to shield herself from objectification was now using her craft to explore its deepest, most complicated truths. This period was marked by a hunger for transformation, both physical and psychological. For V for Vendetta in 2006, she famously shaved her head on camera, a visceral, unfaked moment of character commitment that became one of the film's most powerful images. It was a symbolic act of shedding her own identity, of sacrificing conventional beauty for the sake of the story. She was drawn to directors with singular, often demanding visions. She worked with Wes Anderson on The Darjeeling Limited, with Milos Forman on Goya's Ghosts, and with Wong Kar-wai on My Blueberry Nights. She was building a resume not of a movie star, but of an actor's actor, a collaborator sought out by the world's greatest auteurs. It was this reputation for fearless dedication that brought her back to a project that had been lingering in her orbit for nearly a decade. A dark, terrifying, and artistically ambitious film by director Darren Aronofsky. A psychological thriller set in the beautiful, brutal world of ballet. A film called Black Swan. The role of Nina Sayers felt like the culmination of her entire journey. Nina, a ballerina whose technical perfection masks a profound emotional and sexual repression, was a character that resonated with the themes of Portman's own life. The relentless pursuit of perfection, the suppression of one's darker impulses, the psychological cost of being a good girl. The role required a complete and total surrender. For a full year before filming, Portman threw herself into a punishing training regimen that mirrored the obsessive dedication of her character. She trained for up to 8 hours a day, reshaping her body, enduring a dislocated rib, chronic foot injuries, and a 20-pound weight loss that left her gaunt and skeletal. The physical pain was a constant companion, a tool to access the psychological reality of her character's world. She was not just playing a ballerina, she was attempting to become one, to understand the unique form of madness that comes from a life dedicated to the impossible pursuit of physical perfection. The shoot itself was an immersion into Nina's fragmenting psyche. Aronofsky, known for his intense, psychologically probing methods, fostered an environment of claustrophobic tension. He would reportedly try to create a real-life rivalry between Portman and her co-star, Mila Kunis, to fuel the on-screen dynamic. He pushed Portman to the edge, demanding a performance that was raw, uninhibited, and stripped of all her usual intellectual defenses. "He would say things to me in front of the crew to make me angry," Portman recalled, recognizing it as a technique to break down her composure and access a more primal emotional state. It was a grueling, often painful process. There were nights she went home and thought she was literally going to die. But amidst this artistic torment, a profound and life-altering connection was formed. On set, she met and fell in love with her choreographer, Benjamin Millepied. This blossoming romance became her anchor, a source of light and stability in the psychological darkness of the role. She was exploring disintegration on screen while building a new whole life off-screen. It was a beautiful, surreal paradox, a real-life love story emerging from a cinematic nightmare. The cultural impact of Black Swan upon its release was not that of a film, but of a fever dream that the whole world seemed to share. It was a cinematic event, a terrifying, beautiful, and savagely intelligent exploration of the dark side of ambition. At the heart of this maelstrom was Natalie Portman's performance, an act of such complete physical and psychological immersion that it felt less like acting and more like a public exorcism. The industry and the public alike were in awe. The award season that followed was not a race, it was a coronation. She won every major award, a clean sweep that culminated on the stage of the Shrine Auditorium, where she accepted the Academy Award for Best Actress. Pregnant, glowing, and thanking the man she fell in love with while making the film, she was the living embodiment of an artist who had sacrificed everything and, in return, had gained it all. The Oscar was the ultimate validation, the final gleaming brick in the intellectual fortress she had so carefully constructed. The girl who would rather be smart than a movie star had just been crowned the smartest, most daring movie star in the world. The years after this monumental peak were a period of conscious and deliberate expansion, a move from being the centerpiece of someone else's vision to becoming the visionary herself. The most significant and personal expression of this new chapter was her directorial debut, A Tale of Love and Darkness. For nearly a decade, this project had been her quiet passion. It was an adaptation of the dense, celebrated memoir by the great Israeli author Amos Oz, a story deeply rooted in the history and psyche of her birthplace. Choosing to write, direct, and star in a Hebrew-language film was an act of audacious artistic integrity. It was a rejection of the safe commercial path her career could have easily taken post-Oscar. Instead, she chose to return to her origins, to grapple with the complex legacy of her heritage on her own terms. She cast herself as Fanya, the author's mother, a brilliant, imaginative woman slowly crushed by the weight of history, depression, and unrealized dreams. The character was another of Portman's complex female portraits, a woman whose fierce intellect was both her greatest gift and the source of her deepest sorrow. The film was a labor of love, a project that required her to master a new language of filmmaking. While it was not a commercial blockbuster, its completion was a profound artistic statement. It was proof that she was no longer just an actress for hire. She was an auteur, an artist with a singular voice, in complete control of her own narrative. This desire for authorial control rippled out into all aspects of her life. She became a powerful, articulate, and often fiery advocate for the causes she championed. Her activism, rooted in the same intellectual rigor she applied to her acting roles, was focused and impactful. As a committed vegan, she lent her voice and producing power to the documentary Eating Animals, a stark look at the ethical and environmental costs of factory farming. In the wake of the #MeToo movement, she became a founding member of Time's Up, using her platform to fight for gender equality and an end to systemic harassment in her industry and beyond. Her speeches were not the platitudes of a celebrity. They were meticulously researched, passionately argued, and charged with the same fierce intelligence she had honed since she was a child. The shield she had built for her own protection was now being used to protect others. She was leveraging her power not for personal gain, but for communal progress. During this time, she was also building a family, raising her 2 children, Aleph and Amalia, with a fierce commitment to their privacy. A stark contrast to her own overexposed youth. She was curating a life of purpose, a life where her art, her activism, and her family were all interwoven threads of the same fabric. An artist's life is not a linear progression. It is a series of evolutions, of reactions to the unpredictable currents of both career and personal experience. For Natalie Portman, the last several years have represented another significant recalibration, a period where her carefully constructed world was met with the messy, uncontrollable realities of life, forcing another stage of growth. Her work as an actress continued to be driven by a desire to explore the liminal spaces of the human psyche. Her role in Todd Haynes' 2023 film, May-December, was a prime example of this mature artistic phase. She played Elizabeth, an actress researching a real-life woman, Gracie Julianne Moore, who became a tabloid fixture for her scandalous relationship with a much younger man. The role was a brilliant, intricate puzzle box, a meta-commentary on the very nature of performance, identity, and the morally ambiguous act of artistic creation. It was a quiet, cerebral, and deeply unsettling performance that showcased her mastery of subtlety. She was no longer interested in the grand, physical transformations of Black Swan. She was now exploring the internal, almost invisible transformations of the mind. This artistic evolution was mirrored by a significant expansion of her power behind the scenes. She solidified her role as a producer, founding her own production company, Mountain A, to develop projects from the ground up. This was the final, logical step in her lifelong quest for self-definition. By controlling the stories that were told, she could ensure they reflected her own sensibilities. Complex female-centric narratives that challenged conventions and resisted easy categorization. This move was not about vanity, it was about agency. It was the culmination of a journey that began with a young girl rewriting scripts to protect herself, now a woman greenlighting entire projects to express herself. She was no longer just a part of the Hollywood machine. She was becoming one of its architects, building a space for the kinds of stories and artists she believed in. However, this period of heightened professional control and artistic achievement was shadowed by a profound personal crisis. Her marriage to Benjamin Milpide, the relationship that had been the romantic, stabilizing core of her post-Black Swan life, began to publicly unravel. In the summer of 2023, reports of infidelity and separation shattered the carefully guarded privacy she had maintained for over a decade. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the tabloid media, a force she had expertly navigated and deflected since she was a child, was now focused squarely on the most intimate details of her heartbreak. For an artist who had spent a lifetime controlling her own narrative, the experience of having it so publicly sensationalized was undoubtedly a painful echo of her earliest traumas. The subsequent confirmation of their divorce in early 2024 marked the quiet, dignified end of a chapter that had been born in a moment of supreme artistic triumph. The love story that began amidst the beautiful chaos of Black Swan had found its final, poignant post-credits scene. This experience, however painful, seemed to galvanize her. She faced the public scrutiny with a familiar, steely grace, refusing to perform her grief for the cameras. She poured her energy into her work, into her children, into her activism. The fortress of intellect, once built out of fear, had now become a sanctuary of resilience, a private space of strength that allowed her to weather the public storm with her integrity intact. To chart the legacy of Natalie Portman is to map a 30-year campaign of artistic self-determination. She is a rare figure in modern celebrity culture, a global icon who has never been defined by it. From the very beginning, she has operated as if on a different intellectual plane, engaging with her fame not as a prize to be coveted, but as a complex, often dangerous element to be managed, studied, and ultimately controlled. Her story is the definitive antidote to the tragic child star narrative. She saw the cliff's edge at the age of 12, and instead of running towards it, she began meticulously building a bridge to the other side. A bridge paved with books, with difficult choices, and with an unwavering belief in her own intellectual worth. Her entire career can be read as a series of strategic rebellions against the boxes Hollywood tried to build around her. When they saw a sexualized ingenue in Matilda, she gave them a Harvard intellectual. When they wanted the blockbuster queen of Star Wars, she gave them the emotionally shattered stripper of Closer. When they celebrated her as an Oscar-winning dramatic actress, she gave them a Hebrew-speaking director. She has consistently refused to be what the world expected, choosing instead the more difficult and ultimately more rewarding path of being herself. While her journey is a testament to her profound agency, it also serves as a stark commentary on the immense pressures placed upon women in the public eye. The need to build an intellectual fortress in the first place, the years spent battling imposter syndrome, the recent brutal exposure of her personal heartbreak, all are symptoms of an industry and a culture that are often unforgiving. But she has never allowed herself to be defined as a victim. Her resilience is not passive. It is active, intelligent, and strategic. Her activism is not a hobby. It is an extension of her core belief in using one's voice to challenge injustice. The quiet dignity with which she has navigated her personal life is not weakness. It is a profound display of strength. The final and still evolving image of Natalie Portman is one of quiet, formidable power. It is not the image of the girl with the bob haircut and the potted plant, nor the queen in elaborate makeup, nor the ballerina in a feathered tutu. It is the image of an artist in full command of her instrument and her destiny. A producer in the editing room, a director behind the camera, a mother fiercely protecting her children's right to a normal life. The journey from Natalie Hirschlag, the serious girl who armored herself in books, to Natalie Portman, the visionary artist who now brings her own stories to the world, is complete. She has proven that intelligence is not just a defense mechanism, it is the ultimate creative tool. In a world that constantly demanded she be a movie star, she held fast to her original defiant declaration. She chose to be smart, and in doing so, she redefined what a movie star could be. It was a quiet, unsettling performance that saw her once again exploring the complex, often dark inner lives of women, earning her further critical acclaim and nominations. Professionally, she was expanding her power base, moving more decisively into the role of producer. She was not content to simply be in front of the camera. She wanted to be in the room where the stories were chosen and shaped from the very beginning. This shift was a natural evolution for an artist who had always possessed a formidable intellect and a clear vision for her work. It was the final step in taking complete ownership of her career, ensuring that the narratives she helped bring to the world were ones that aligned with her own deeply held values of telling complex, female-driven stories. She was building an empire not of celebrity but of substance. However, this period of professional empowerment was set against the backdrop of a quiet and painful personal storm. Her marriage to Benjamin Millepied, the relationship that had been forged in the intense, beautiful crucible of Black Swan, began to fracture. In the summer of 2023, whispers of marital trouble and infidelity became a roar of public speculation, a harsh and unwelcome intrusion into the private world she had so carefully guarded for over a decade. The machinery of celebrity gossip, which she had successfully held at bay for so long, was now grinding away at the foundations of her personal life. In March 2024, it was confirmed that their divorce had been finalized. The love story that had seemed like a fairy tale, the ballerina and the choreographer falling in love during the creation of a masterpiece, had come to an end. It was a poignant, heartbreaking echo of the themes that have defined her life and work. The immense pressure of the spotlight, the difficulty of maintaining authenticity in an artificial world, and the quiet, often unseen sacrifices that are made for both art and love. The end of this chapter was not a public spectacle. In keeping with her character, it was handled with a quiet dignity, a resolute and steely grace. This convergence of professional control and personal turmoil marks a new and perhaps most interesting phase of her life. She is now an artist in her early 40s, a veteran who has navigated the treacherous waters of the industry for over 3 decades. She has survived child stardom, sexualization, blockbuster backlash, and the intense psychological demands of her craft. She has known the highest highs of professional acclaim and the quiet lows of personal heartbreak. The fortress of intellect she built as a child for protection has now been fully integrated into her being, not as a shield but as her core strength. It is the foundation upon which she continues to build, to create, and to evolve. She is no longer the prodigy trying to prove her seriousness, nor the star risking her sanity for a role. She is the master of her own narrative, a woman who has lived through the fire and emerged with a quiet, unshakable strength, ready for the next act. The legacy of Natalie Portman is a masterclass in artistic endurance and intellectual self-definition. She is a figure who has been in the public eye for more than 30 years, yet has managed to retain an aura of enigmatic intelligence, a sense that her inner world is far richer and more complex than anything seen on screen. Her story is a powerful counter-narrative to the tragic trope of the child star. She did not burn out, she did not fade away, she did not become a casualty of early fame. Instead, she diagnosed the predatory nature of the industry at a startlingly young age and methodically constructed a life and career that would allow her to survive it and ultimately to master it. Her journey was a constant, deliberate act of rebellion against categorization. When the world wanted to label her a Lolita, she became a Harvard scholar. When Hollywood expected her to be a blockbuster queen, she pursued dark, dangerous, and artistically demanding roles. When the industry saw her as a performer, she became a director, a writer, a producer. She refused to be placed in any box, and if one was built around her, she would use her formidable intellect to dismantle it from the inside. Her story is, in part, a cautionary tale about the brutal cost of fame, particularly for young women. The early sexualization she endured, the backlash from fan culture, the recent public dissection of her private life, all are testament to the often toxic relationship between the public and the figures it professes to admire. But to see her as a victim is to fundamentally misunderstand her. Her narrative is ultimately one of profound agency. It is a story of resilience, of a woman who faced down the ugliest parts of her industry and her own insecurities with a quiet, unyielding fortitude. She is a powerful example of an artist who understood that the greatest performance is not one given on a film set, but the one conducted in the crafting of one's own life. The fortress of seriousness she built as a child was not an act, it was a choice. The decision to go to Harvard was not a detour, it was a declaration. The descent into the madness of Black Swan was not a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. The final defining image of Natalie Portman is not of the child assassin, the galactic queen, or the doomed ballerina. It is the image of a woman in full command of her craft, her voice, and her narrative. The young girl who once used her grandmother's maiden name to protect her family's privacy has now imbued the name Natalie Portman with a new meaning, a synonym for intelligence, integrity, and artistic courage. She did not simply survive the treacherous landscape of Hollywood. She redrew the map. From the quiet, studious girl who armored herself in books to the powerful, visionary artist who now tells her own stories, Natalie Portman's greatest role has been the unwavering, 30-year performance of becoming herself.